Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous research center housed in the University of Lahore and tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. And this program is part of that effort. Now, this episode is the second part of our program on the Palestinian question. And since the 7th October attack on Israel by Hamas and the Palestinian Jihad fighters, Israel has devastated Gaza from the air and through ground assaults. Where is the situation headed? What are the possible outcomes? And what role, if any, the Arab and the Muslim world can play to mitigate the tragedy that is unfolding in Gaza and also the occupied Palestinian territories? With me is Professor Joseph Massad, a professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia, and a regular contributor to Middle East Eye. If you've missed the first episode, you will find the link below this one. Joseph, thank you. Now, we talked about ancient and medieval and, the history, and of course, also the run-up to the formation of Israel, land stolen from the Palestinians. Now, as you and I speak, things are obviously grave. I think even that is a mild word for what's happening in Gaza, which is nothing less than genocide. As I mentioned in the previous episode, also, even the International Court of Justice has put Israel on notice regarding that. Now, this program is being recorded as Antony Blinken, he's on his sixth tour of the Middle East. The Americans finally are coming around to actually presenting which will be voted later today, Friday afternoon, Eastern time in the United States. Where do you think the things are headed? Hamas has given its own blueprint to the Israelis. Netanyahu seems to go against everyone, including Joe Biden, who is now finally coming around to looking at the situation slightly differently from the time when he thought that there cannot be any daylight between Israel and the United States. So what is your assessment of where it's going?
The United States as the major party to this war and to this genocide, a supporter of this war and of this genocide, an active participant in arming Israel, in providing it with intelligence, and even in having possibly soldiers and consultants on the ground from different kinds of reports that we've heard over the last few months, continues to be involved in inflicting this genocide on the Palestinian people. Indeed, Secretary Blinken has had the audacity in the last few days to inform the Qataris that their role, for which they had been prescribed by the Americans as mediators between Hamas, the Americans, and Israel, is one that may be ending, and that unless Hamas submits to America's imperial and genocidal terms, that the Qataris should expel Hamas leaders from Qatar, according to reports that I've read this morning. Some American officials claiming that this is Blinken's recent letter. Remember, Blinken has been as much of a fabricator and a liar about what has happened since October 7th as Joe Biden and the Israelis. It was, of course, Joe Biden and Blinken who gave statements claiming that they had seen or have incontrovertible evidence that allegedly the Palestinian resistance fighters had killed babies, which of course now has been debunked as nothing short of gruesome propaganda by the Israelis, amongst others. These are, the Americans, I don't think, have come around. On the contrary, Biden and Blinken have now responded to the earliest proposition by Netanyahu of continuing the closure of the Egyptian border with Gaza and opening up the seas through the Americans, presumably under the pretext of sending provisions to the starving Palestinian population who are being starved as a strategy of war by the Israelis. It's a deliberate starvation campaign, although Secretary Blinken claims that they have not yet seen proof that the Israelis are using famine as a weapon of war, which of course everyone sees as the existing situation. But the idea of this attempting to have some kind of a sea entry point to Palestine is to actually facilitate the possible expulsion of the Palestinians from Gaza, since Egypt is refusing to take them in. The idea is that they can be expelled through this new sea route that Biden has opened up, pretending it's his idea when it was in fact Netanyahu's idea. And of course, Gaza has an old port that has been there, even though the Israelis had closed it down, that could have been used, let's say, as a point of entry. But no, the Israelis insisted, and the Americans, of course, satisfied them by opening this particular sea route connecting the middle of Gaza, where the Israelis have just opened a new sort of highway to divide North and South Gaza, so that the Israelis would be in charge, presumably, of distributing provisions. As you might know, the Israelis in the last few days have targeted and assassinated the police officer in charge of the distribution of food, which had gone to northern Gaza. They killed him for his coordination of this distribution efforts, and they killed a couple of dozen, more than 24 aid workers who were involved in the distribution of food. So the continued starvation of the population, the continued genocidal bombing that has killed upwards of 31,000 people, injured upwards of 70,000 people, thousands more are dead under the rubble. We don't know the real number of the Palestinians who have been killed. All of that continues to be part of Netanyahu's strategy. And the only thing that the Americans are upset about is that he seems not to have good PR. He's embarrassing them by not covering up Israel's crimes better. And by fabricating lies that have been, in fact, exposed as lies, even by the exceedingly obsequious mainstream American and European press, whose racism against Palestinians, whose support of the arguments for the genocide of the Palestinians continue unhindered.
Well, Netanyahu possibly could not have covered up all this because of a number of very brave Gazans who have been relaying to the world every atrocity. And then, of course, there are the Gazan reporters for Al Jazeera, and whether Arabic or English, who have been essentially, they've been putting their lives on line to relay to the world exactly what is happening. So Netanyahu, even if he wanted to, could not have covered this up. But before we proceed further, I just want to touch upon what you said with reference to the Hamas attack. Now, in the initial months of this war, even the Palestinians living in the West, or Westerns who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, would be brought on these channels and various YouTube programs. And the first question that would be thrown at them would be, do you condemn the terrorist attack by Hamas, the Hamas atrocities? Now, you're right. Much of that propaganda has been debunked. Electronic Intifada has been very, among other outlets, has been very keen. They've done an investigation that they've debunked it. We now know that New York Times has a lot of egg on its face, even though it still hasn't really gone and actually begun to start reporting the events as they should be reported. But how does one counter this? I want to ask you this. I mean, how do you look at and I want your opinion, how do you look at the Hamas attack? Would you consider what Hamas did as before you begin to accuse Israel of these atrocities, would you begin by saying that what Hamas did was atrocious?
First of all, I think I consider what happened on October 7th was a prison break. Right, people were living in a concentration camp controlled by Israel since since the occupation in 1967, but also since 2006, essentially, when Gaza has been blockaded by the Israelis, and where the Palestinians of Gaza have been living in an open-air prison, a veritable concentration camp. So this was, people breaking out of this concentration camp. And our understanding is that, of course, which is legitimate under international law, the Palestinian people have the right to defend themselves and to struggle to end an illegal occupation. They have the right to armed struggle according to the United Nations and international law. So I believe the attack, of course, that targeted the military bases and checkpoints around Gaza was absolutely legitimate as far as international law is concerned. This was an act of resistance for national liberation. Now, were some atrocities committed against civilians? Clearly, a large number of civilians have been killed. We do not know the circumstances of the death of the majority of those people. What we do have confirmed is that many have been killed by Israeli friendly fire. It is unclear if these civilians were targeted deliberately by Hamas. I mean, clearly, some civilians were targeted to be taken as hostages, as were soldiers, to exchange the large number of Palestinian abductees that lay in Israel's dungeons. But I have seen no evidence, no unassailable evidence that Hamas had a deliberate campaign of mass killing of civilians. And given the large number of Israeli propaganda from the allegations of rape, which to date have not produced a single victim or survivor of rape to testify to any commission, including the United Nations, the baked babies, the alleged disembowelment of pregnant women, all of which have been exposed as gruesome lies and fabrications by the Israelis. And of course, the latest lie of accusing workers of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, as being Hamas members, which has also been debunked as yet another lie. Now, once there's an actual investigation to see how many of these Israeli civilians had died, then we can assess what kinds of who is responsible for these atrocities directly. At this stage, of course, the idea to speak about what happened on October 7th is to pretend that everything before October 7th didn't exist. We are speaking about a settler colonial movement that has begun to take over Palestine since the 1880s and has targeted the Palestinian people and their lands, a large theft of Palestinian land, especially after 1948 and after 1967, huge atrocities committed from the 1930s onwards. In 1948 alone, the Zionist militias killed upwards of 13,000 Palestinians, 11,000 of whom were civilians. Before Gaza, before October 7th, you had upwards of 100,000 Palestinians and other Arabs who had been killed by the Zionist settlers since Zionism had begun. So to begin to speak about October 7th as some kind of a strange occurrence is an attempt to cheat your audience of the actual historical background of what happened. Also, of course, what is always interesting, and as I've written about in my recent op-ed, that all Israeli attacks in the West are depicted as retaliatory. But of course, as if the Palestinian resistance offensive of October 7th was not a retaliation against the ongoing siege, occupation, and brutalization of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Of course, I see all Palestinian resistance as in retaliation for Zionist settler colonialism. Now, I, of course, may criticize, all kinds of methods of this resistance, but it does not make it any less retaliatory or any less of a resistance operation. And again, but with regards to the events of October 7th, I cannot speak to what was committed against Israeli civilians, given the huge sort of mountain of lies that the Israelis have put out there and had been exposed since October 7th. We need to have an independent investigation that the Israelis refuse to allow, an international investigation to find out how civilians were killed, especially as many people out there believe, and there's some evidence to support that, that perhaps the majority of Israeli civilians might have been killed by indiscriminate Israeli bombings, by friendly fire that targeted Hamas, but couldn't, or Hamas fighters or Palestinians, but could not distinguish between Israeli civilians and the Hamas fighters. So I'm not able to render judgment on this, except, of course, to say that it's a tragic loss of life. But we need to know the conditions under which this happened before we can render judgment.
Absolutely. In fact, in the earlier phases of the war, if I remember correctly, within about three weeks of that, Haaretz had a report quoting sources from the Israeli police talking about the fact that one of the, that famous rave where lots of civilians got killed, that many of them got killed because there was an Israeli helicopter gunship that started firing at the Palestinian fighters, and in that process also ended up killing a lot of Israelis. Apart from that, we also know that Israel has the Hannibal Protocol, which dictates that they are going to... Yeah, so they're not going to allow anyone to take an Israeli hostage, and if that means the hostage also gets killed, so be it. And Al Jazeera did an entire documentary on that. Plus, they have this Da'iya doctrine, which was developed by Gadi Eskenot, who's part of the war cabinet, which is about indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, which is exactly what they've been doing in Gaza. But Joseph, where do we go from here? If Netanyahu has made it clear that he's not going to stop. He's already got the plans for a ground assault on Rafah. And as I said, they've already started bombing parts of Rafah. And he has basically cocked a snook at Joe Biden, saying, well, you might want me to do something else, but I'm going to do what I think I have to do. And leaving aside the war cabinet, he also knows that his real strength is the pre-war cabinet, which is populated by the right-wingers.
I mean, remember, today, the differences between Netanyahu and his antagonists in the Israeli government or on the Israeli political scene, or between Netanyahu and the American government, is not about the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians, is not about the conquest of Gaza and the destruction of Palestinian resistance, but about what is the most effective method to do so. So we are not speaking about people who are defending the Palestinians at all, despite the kinds of silly bromides that the White House and the State Department put out there while they continue to support materially the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. You can't, we don't really know. What we do know is that the Americans, in a kind of ongoing imperial naivete, speak of the day after the Palestinian resistance is eliminated.
I was going to come to that, but go on.
Palestinian resistance clearly has not been eliminated as of now. Indeed, this is why Israel continues to be enraged, as are the Americans, that after more than 5 months, we are in the 6th month of this genocidal war that Israel has imposed on the Palestinian people, and the Israelis have not been able to achieve a single military goal that they or aim that they had set up for themselves. On the contrary, they have not been able to eliminate or weaken the Palestinian resistance. The only achievement the Israeli military should be proud of, as it has always been proud of, is in fact genocidal acts against civilians. This is what the Israeli army has done, and the outright destruction of Gaza's civilian infrastructure, the targeting of universities and schools and mosques and libraries, and of course hospitals. These are all, of course, targeted deliberately to eliminate the possibility of an afterlife for the civilian population of Gaza. But so far, they have not been able to defeat the resistance. I mean, just think about it. The US and its allies were able to defeat Iraq, a major army, within 5 weeks, yet the Israelis have not been able to actually conquer or defeat a Palestinian resistance movement that has grown up in a concentration camp under siege by Israel that controls and surveils every inch of Gaza and has done so, since 1967. So it does speak volumes about the utter incompetence and unpreparedness of the Israeli military when it comes to defeating, sort of the Palestinian resistance, and its high competence in being able to eliminate civilian populations in the tens of thousands. But what is going to happen after that is, you have basically the Palestinian collaborator regime in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, who are subcontracted by the Americans and the Israelis as enforcers of the Israeli occupation, who are collaborating today in the hope that they can get a say in running Gaza, presumably after Hamas is defeated. These are all fictions and fantasies that the Arab regimes that are all agents of the US today, and as are many regimes in the Muslim world as well, are all in on this, right? This is why they're unable to stand up to the Americans or to the Israelis. They also issue bromides of how they're against the war, against the genocide, while at the same time maintaining open or secret relations with the Israelis, maintaining, in fact, routes to help support the ongoing Israeli war while pretending to be helping the Palestinians. And this includes a number of Arab countries, of course.
Just to add to what you're saying, what we have seen in the last 3 or 4 days, but especially since Blinken's arrival in the Middle East, we have these reports coming out with reference to efforts being on in terms of Saudi-Israeli normalization. Of course, the Palestinian Authority being given charge in Gaza. And so since you talked about the day after, Netanyahu, on the other hand, plans to basically reoccupy Gaza. And there have been people who are talking, Jared Kushner has talked about pushing the Palestinians towards the Negev and putting up a tent, city there. And he has said that Gaza should be turned into a resort of sorts. So there are lots of these things that are going on. But on an ironic but slightly lighter note, somebody on Twitter sent a joke from the West Bank. This young Palestinian applies for a job to the Palestinian Authority. And so after the initial interview and everything, after he's filled out the forms and everything, there's this interview, and the interviewer asks him, among other questions, have you ever been in any employment that was against the Palestinian interests? So this guy replies, no, this is the first time. So, so the point being that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, there have been surveys now. I just saw a recent survey. There's not even 12% of the people who want Mahmoud Abbas. And even though he is now named a new prime minister, I don't know how that's going to pan out. But this day after thing looks more like a fantasy than anything else.
I believe it is a fantasy. Of course, for Jared Kushner, the parochialism of the American business class is only matched by the American intellectual class on this question. But Jared Kushner, of course, is a real estate agent, and he thinks the problem in Palestine is a problem of real estate, right? But this is the parochialism of American politics and mainstream sort of opinion on these questions. Yes, the Palestinian Authority has been, like I said, subcontracted since the Oslo Accords in 1993 as an enforcer of the occupation. This was very important for the Israelis, who have tried ever since the Palestinian Liberation Movement had received international recognition as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, from the late 60s, but especially from the mid-70s, after the UN recognized the PLO in 74, after the non-aligned movement recognized the PLO in 73, that they wanted to find an alternative to the PLO who would be essentially sort of under their thumbs, who would be chosen by the Israeli regime against the interests of the Palestinian people. They've had several tries. They've tried with mayors that they had elected in the West Bank in 1972 that didn't work. In fact, that backfired in 76 when the mayors that were elected were all pro-PLO mayors. Then they tried with another sort of stupid strategy called the village leagues in 1978 to choose sort of village elders in the Palestinian countryside as collaborators. That also was unsuccessful. They're trying to actually replicate this today in Gaza, the scandal of the village leagues. But they were unable to. So a golden opportunity presented itself to them after 1991. At that time, of course, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Camp had collapsed, and as a result, the Palestinians lost a huge amount of diplomatic support in international fora with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Camp. And Arafat's miscalculation in the position that he took on the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait had cost at the time the PLO all the financial support it used to receive from all the Gulf countries, including from Iraq, which of course was under siege at that time. So being bankrupt financially, bankrupt diplomatically, Arafat had no choice in 1993 but to transform the PLO into the anti-PLO. And this was the golden opportunity for the Israelis. In a way, it's like transforming the African National Congress into Gotcha Buthelezi, that Nelson Mandela becomes Gotcha Buthelezi. But this is Arafat becomes the anti-Arafat in a way. Not that Arafat was so radical to begin with, but nonetheless, the PLO ceased to represent the interests of the Palestinian people in 1993 and became an agent of the Americans, the European Union, and the Israelis in enforcing this ongoing settler colonial occupation with, I would say, the alliance of the Palestinian business class, who found it opportune to make a buck or two in the occupied territories, and they've made several bucks since then, I can assure you.
Yeah, this point about Buthelezi, I remember you made in one of your op-eds also, and I remember chuckling when I read that. But here's the thing: how long can, if we don't get a ceasefire? Hamas obviously wants a permanent ceasefire. Hamas has given a blueprint. The Israelis have rejected that. Hamas had earlier rejected the Israeli proposal or the Israeli-American proposal of a 6-week ceasefire. So where is this headed? I mean, for how long can the Gazans bear the losses that they have to bear every day? I mean, people getting maimed, buried under the rubble, getting killed.
According to a poll that I read this morning by a liberal pro-American pollster in the West Bank, the majority of Gazans that have been polled continue to blame Israel and the US for what is happening to them and not Hamas. So Hamas continues to command great support amongst Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as around the Arab world more generally. It is, of course, notable that despite massive demonstrations across several Arab countries, the Arab regimes that are agents of the US, they're are using, of course, their repressive apparatuses, which the U.S., of course, had set up for them, and trains their police forces to repress their populations and prevent more open solidarity with the Palestinian people. This is, of course, in contrast to what we saw, say, in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, and when it killed upwards of 18 to 20,000 people, so much so that the ultra-Zionist President Ronald Reagan at the time accused Israel of committing, and I quote, a Holocaust in Lebanon. And of course, at that time, the first accusations by the Soviet Union and other countries at the time of Israel as committing genocide began to be sort of leveled against Israel. So this is not the first time that accusations of genocide. However, the scale today is much larger, as we can see. The role of South Africa as a champion of the Palestinian people is exceedingly important. Of course, it exposes Arab regimes and regimes in Muslim countries as, if not collaborators or explicit collaborators with Israel and the US, at least as tacit collaborators, even though some of these countries have tried to jump on the bandwagon of South Africa. But still, Arab countries who have relations with Israel did not cut them off at all, as, for example, a number of Latin American countries had done. So it is clear now that the Arab regimes not only are direct allies of Israel and enemies of the Palestinian people, but also have very small maneuverability as agents of the US, as puppets of the US government. And they understand, which is a bit surprising, that they continue to think that their survival hinges on the survival of Israel. The survival of Israel as a settler colonial apartheid Jewish supremacist racist state is no longer guaranteed. On the contrary, there's a major, of course, move internationally and amongst the Palestinians that this state has to be undone as it exists, to be replaced by a state that offers equality and democracy to all the population. And as we know, democracy and equality are a fate worse than death for Jewish colonial settlers, as they had been to French colonial settlers in Algeria, or English settlers in Rhodesia or in Kenya. Settlers love sort of a master race democracy for themselves and apartheid for those who don't belong to their race. So to offer them equality is considered horrifying. This is why the French colonial settlers of Algeria left back to France when offered equality by the Algerian post-independence government, as had the settlers of Tunisia, as had the settlers of Kenya, and even of Rhodesia, right? So the idea is that these settlers are love to live in Israel as much, or so far as Israel is able to offer them colonial, racial, and religious privileges, but they would have, they would rather sort of leave the country if offered democracy. But this is a possibility. The idea, this two-state solution, kind of bogus rhetoric, doesn't have a chance, has not had a chance of ever coming to fruition. The idea of recognizing a Palestinian state that is another Bantustan is laughable. The Americans continue to offer this as a palliative. That's not going to work. And why should it work? Even if there were to be an actual independent Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, why should anyone accept Israel's right to remain a Jewish supremacist racist state? No state should have that right. Israel continues to be ruled by over 65 racist laws that guarantee Jewish supremacy in Israel. No one should accept that, even if there are two other Palestinian states, not only one. The idea is you cannot sacrifice the more than 22% of the Israeli population who are Palestinian citizens to continue to live forever under a Jewish supremacist racist state in Israel governed by these laws. So this palliative is only used rhetorically by the Arab governments who claim to continue to support a two-state solution, which is not tenable. Billions of dollars.
I'm assuming, well, not just assuming, it's fairly clear from what you're saying that just like Professor Edward Said, you also are not particularly enamored of a two-state solution. And incidentally, just 29 days before he was assassinated, in the Knesset, when Rabin made a speech with reference to the peace agreement. And that speech is there for anyone to actually go through it. He said, we're not talking about a Palestinian state. We're talking about an administrative authority. So even Rabin had absolutely no intention of having a sovereign Palestinian state.
This has been the same position of the Zionist movement since the 1920s. At the time, the head of the Zionist organization, Chaim Weizmann, insisted to the British that the British, in line with the League of Nations, could not offer the Palestinian population of Palestine democracy or set up a parliament for them, as they tried to do in the other mandated territories. He explained to them that if you offer them democracy, then we cannot set up a Jewish colonial settler state. They are a majority. We still haven't brought enough settlers. So they cannot be any democratic procedure in Palestine until we have a majority and we could expel the population. He was absolutely horrified, but he said that in fact all we could offer the Palestinians are precisely administrative duties, control over their educational system, although even that is not on offer. The Israelis, as you know, and the Americans now intervene in writing the curricula, not only of the Palestinian schools, but also of the entire Arab and Muslim world. They want to actually impose a Western curriculum on the educational institutions across the Arab world, not only in Palestine and the Muslim world. So that was on offer since the late 20s by the Zionists, saying we will not offer them anything more than this. They can control their sewage system, their garbage collection, and maybe their education. We see this repeated actually in the Camp David Accords that were signed with Anwar Sadat of Egypt, where Sadat also claimed that he had defended or represented the Palestinians. Begin offered an autonomy plan. Also, it was sort of like a gradual Gaza first plan, then the West Bank, which is what ended up happening under Oslo. The Israelis have been actually principled on this since the 1920s. All they have offered has always been in the form of sewage control, some control over education and the transportation system, a sort of municipal autonomy of sorts. That is all. They want to call that, these collections of Bantustan, a state. This is a joke since the early 1990s. Nothing new is being offered by the Americans, except yet a renewal of this stale rhetoric that is unconvincing and unpersuasive.
I absolutely agree.
What is important in all these negotiations, what is important for the Americans and the European Union and Israel, as well as its Arab allies today, continues to be that whatever quote-unquote solution to this colonial situation has to preserve Israel as a racist state at the end, that nothing can touch this cornerstone of European, American, and American policy, that Israel has to be maintained as a racist state, that Jews have to continue to be the supreme race of Israel. Nothing can touch that. But then we can talk about what else we can do. So as long as there is a commitment for Israel to remain a racist Jewish state, nothing will change. Nothing will change.
Well, interestingly, Shlomo San talked about a two-state solution, and he is in favor of that. And so someone asked him, why not one state? And he said, Israelis are the most racist people on the face of this earth, and therefore I don't think that there can be a single state. But
I don't think Israelis are the most racist. I think white Americans are racist. I think white Europeans are racist. I don't think. The Europeans, the Americans, the other white settler colonies, the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders. These people do not support the rights of the Aborigines of Australia, of the Native Americans, of the First Nations of Canada, of the Native Americans of Latin America, of the Maoris of New Zealand, to have rights, not only the Palestinians. So there is this kind of structural racism of Europe is one that Israeli Jews partake of course. And this is why I say, unless there was a program to dismantle the racist and institutional structures of the Israeli state and transforming it into a state that is no longer racist and that offers democratic equal rights to all its citizens or the people under its rule, then nothing will change. Palestinian resistance will continue.
The structured violence, I mean, you talked about schooling and the curricula. I mean, we all know the horrific scandal of the Canadian schools for the Indians, the Canadian Indians. So all of this is on record. But before I close this episode, I want to ask you something. Last year, Ilan Pape, who, as you know, is an Israeli historian, he was being interviewed, and he spoke of Israel as a settler colonial project, and then went on to say that because it is a settler colonial project, it is bound to be destroyed at some point. But then he added that before it gets to that point of destruction, it will become more savage, more cruel, and it will be that much harder on the Palestinians. Now, is this something that you would agree with? You really think that Israel is headed towards destruction in and through its own actions, in and through being a settler colonial project?
The United States is a settler colonial state, so is Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and they have survived. But many of the Latin American countries continue to be settler colonial states run by white or mestizo elites, especially in countries where Native Americans or Indians are the majority. Especially in the Andean countries, if you will. The problem, I think, with Israel is that Israel, like other colonial states who had perished, might end because of its demographic vulnerability. So it was unable to kill all the Palestinians. I mean, it's trying to do that now in Gaza. And as a result, Jews have become a minority. Even a decade ago, Jews have become a minority in Israel. And that is what is spelling the possible end of the Jewish settler colonial project. No settler colonial regime or country survived with more than half its population being the native population for very long. So I suspect Ilan Pape is coming from this perspective. And I do think he is right that the Israelis would continue to be more barbaric in their atrocities against the Palestinian people and against their neighbors, whether Lebanon or Syria, which they continue to bomb periodically, as we know. But this is, the Israelis themselves are worried about the end of Israel. In the last few years, Netanyahu himself has been concerned about Israel reaching the age of 80, let alone the age of 100. They have some mythological associations with the ancient Jewish kingdoms, which did not survive for more than 60 to 80 years. And so there's some of that ongoing. Indeed, upwards of 1 million, possibly 2 million Israeli Jews now have dual nationalities with West European and East European countries, as well as the US and other white countries. I think, if their racial privileges are threatened by democracy in Israel, they would definitely go to Europe, the US, Canada, or Australia, where white privilege continues to be respected. So they would rather live in these countries than remain in Israel. So there's an expectation by a good portion of the Israeli Jewish population that they need to make alternate plans should this project come to naught. I'm not a prophet, I have no idea, but I do think that, of course, the major Palestinian resistance, the BDS movement outside, the ongoing armed resistance and civil disobedience ongoing in the West Bank, inside Israel itself by Palestinians, and in Gaza, with international pressure, is mounting more and more. The International Court of Justice earlier sort of consideration that Israel is committing genocide as a plausible accusation that it is now in the process of adjudicating. All of these things could lead to more and more major boycotts of Israel. And I think Canada, amazingly enough, a very friendly white settler colony of Israel, has recently stopped or taken the step of no longer sending weapons to Israel for the duration of this war. This is all, I think, ominous to Israel.
The top court in the Netherlands has said that the country cannot send parts of the F-35 fighter jet to Israel.
Aside from the Americans, only Germany, which I call the Fourth Reich, is basically the only country that continues to stand by the Israelis. And German anti-Semitism and racism, of course, continues in new guise. They've displaced all the racism against Jews now to Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims, but they continue to be just as racist as they had always been. But at any rate, I think these are the two countries that are most committed to them, as of course is Britain, although there's a huge opposition now. I think, these countries.
But I think lots of things are changing incrementally. Some are changing at a faster pace than others, and then of course you have the second and third order effects of what has happened, of the Palestinian resistance. I also believe that we have seen a sort of horizontal escalation, which Israel was not expecting, nobody really knew or thought that Houthis will jump into the fray. Everyone was afraid of Hezbollah, of course, but the Houthis in many ways have been more effective in some ways. There's been the commodification of weapons technology. You now have a $200 Al Yassin tandem charge anti-tank guided missile that can knock out a $3.5 million Merkava tank. So, lots of things are happening. And it seems that in the days and months and years to come, there are likely to be events that we cannot obviously predict right now. But I'm hopeful that Israelis will not be able to dent the resistance spirit of the Palestinians. But thank you so much, Joseph. I'm really grateful for the earlier episode, which gave us an insight into the history, and also this episode where we've spoken about the current events. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussion. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.